Hello, everyone, and a big welcome to the Real Thread channel. Please remember to subscribe and hit that like button if you enjoy our content. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie Suami Kontrak yang Posesif nonton online. The narrative unfolds around a seemingly conventional arrangement, a contract marriage, which soon spirals into something far more complex and fraught with emotional entanglement. Our protagonist, perhaps a young woman striving for independence or financial stability, finds herself bound to a man whose initial detached professionalism quickly curdles into an all-consuming possessiveness. This dynamic is immediately compelling because it plays upon the tension between a transactional agreement and the messy reality of human attachment. The husband, let's call him RD, isn't merely playing the part of a demanding spouse. His actions betray a deep-seated insecurity masked by an almost cinematic control over his new wife's every move. One gets the sense, observing his meticulous oversight, perhaps demanding constant updates on her whereabouts, scrutinizing her interactions with colleagues, that Artie comes from a world where control equals safety. Maybe his background is in high-stakes finance or a demanding field where precision is paramount, a discipline he now applies ruthlessly to his personal life. This juxtaposition, a powerful figure in the external world rendered fragile and controlling within his own home, is the story's core engine. The wife, navigating this unexpected captivity masquerading as marriage, begins to chafe. Her own ambitions, perhaps in a creative field like graphic design or journalism, demand a freedom of movement and thought that Artie actively stifles. We see moments where she tries to assert small boundaries, a late night working on a passion project, a coffee meeting with an old university friend, only to have those small assertions met with disproportionate, chilling reactions from Artie. It's reminiscent of classic psychological thrillers where the environment itself becomes the antagonist. The plot thickens when an external character, perhaps an old flame of the wife or a professional rival of Artie's, enters the picture, serving as a catalyst for Artie's possessiveness to reach fever pitch. This outsider represents everything Artie fears losing control over: genuine, unmonitored connection. Artie's surveillance, initially subtle, becomes overt, perhaps involving tracking devices or thinly veiled threats delivered with the calm authority of a CEO issuing a quarterly directive. What elevates this from a simple drama is the slow, almost reluctant recognition by the wife that beneath the suffocating control lies a twisted form of devotion. It's not healthy love, certainly, but it's an obsession that validates her existence within his narrow frame. This realization complicates her desire to escape. She starts to question if the stability, albeit tyrannical, offered by Artie is preferable to the uncertainty of true freedom, especially if that freedom means facing the world alone again. The climax invariably involves a confrontation where the contract, the very legal framework that bound them, is shattered, either physically or emotionally. The wife must choose between perpetuating the arrangement, accepting the gilded cage, or breaking free, knowing that severing ties with someone so intensely attached might invite danger. The ending, as these stories often dictate, rarely offers a clean resolution. Rather, it leaves the audience pondering the true cost of security versus the terrifying beauty of autonomy, suggesting that some emotional contracts, once signed, leave indelible scars no matter how the ink is finally erased. The initial contract, likely signed with a blend of pragmatism and a slight nervous excitement about the potential financial windfall or social standing it offered, quickly transforms into an oppressive atmosphere. Imagine the wife Perhaps an aspiring screenwriter whose mind is constantly spinning narratives and plotting escapes, now finding her own life script hijacked. Her inspiration, once drawn from observing the vibrant, chaotic world, is now confined to the meticulously ordered, sterile environment Artie mandates. She begins to internalize his gaze, checking her reflection not for vanity, but for compliance, a subtle but devastating shift in self-perception. Artie's background often informs his behavior. Perhaps he rose rapidly in the tech industry, where agility and proprietary information demand absolute secrecy and loyalty. This professional paranoia bleeds into his marriage, viewing his wife not as a partner, but as an asset requiring rigorous protection from external threats, namely, anyone who might draw her attention away from him. His attempts at affection are therefore transactional, gifts bestowed like dividends rather than spontaneous expressions of care. A designer handbag arrives after he has ruthlessly questioned her dinner meeting, a silent bribe to reinforce the hierarchy. The emotional landscape is further muddied by moments of genuine, albeit misplaced, tenderness. There are late nights when Artie, perhaps exhausted from a grueling day of empire building, lets the mask slip just enough to reveal a profound loneliness. He might watch her sleep with an expression of almost heartbreaking vulnerability, suggesting that his possessiveness isn't just about ownership. It's a desperate attempt to anchor himself to something real in a life built on volatile numbers and shifting loyalties. These fleeting glimpses of the man beneath the tyrant are what confuse the wife most, muddying the waters between genuine fear and the pull of codependency. When the external figure appears, let us say, a charismatic director who recognizes the untapped talent in the screenwriter's early drafts, the tension becomes almost unbearable. This director represents professional validation achieved outside Artie's sphere of influence. Artie's reaction isn't mere jealousy. It's an existential threat to his carefully constructed reality where she is solely his creation, his companion, his property. We see Artie deploy tactics refined in boardrooms, subtle sabotage, spreading rumors about the director's unreliability, or simply orchestrating unavoidable accidents that keep his wife confined at home, citing manufactured emergencies. The psychological pressure mounts until the wife feels her own identity fragmenting, unsure which voice, her own creative yearning, or Artie's suffocating approval is louder. The film hinges on whether she can reclaim the narrative voice stolen from her by this possessive, controlling love. The weight of the contract becomes palpable, a tangible chain woven from glossy legal paper and unspoken expectations. The wife, whose initial attraction to Artie might have been a complicated mix of admiration for his evident success, perhaps he's a titan in real estate development, accustomed to shaping skylines, and the sheer convenience of their arrangement now feels the foundation of her own aspirations crumbling beneath the pressure. She might have envisioned her career as a blossoming garden, but Artie has encased it in a climate-controlled, soundproofed dome where the only permissible growth is that which he sanctions. Her internal monologue, usually the fertile ground for her creative work, turns into a constant, low-grade tactical assessment. How long can I stay at the studio before he calls? What plausible reason can I offer for the delayed response to his text? This constant self-monitoring drains her, leaving her intellectually starved. We see her trying to inject small acts of rebellion, wearing a vibrant, slightly too bright scarf he dislikes, or humming a tune from her rebellious college days when he's preoccupied with a conference call. But these minute transgressions are noted, cataloged, and subtly punished, perhaps by an immediate cancellation of their planned weekend trip, or a chilling silence that lasts for days. Artie's possessiveness manifests not only through restrictions, but through suffocating gifts. He might furnish her home office with the most cutting-edge, expensive equipment, ensuring she has no legitimate reason to leave the house for supplies, effectively trapping her with tools of her own trade. This generosity is a form of preemptive control, arguing wordlessly that everything she needs, everything she is provided by him. This blurring of benefactor and jailer is where the film finds its darkest irony. The external threat, the charismatic director, embodies the wife's unlived life. He sees the brilliance she has been hiding, perhaps admiring a portfolio she cautiously shared online before the marriage, before Artie insisted she take down her public profiles. When Artie intercepts a crucial email, a genuine opportunity for a meeting, perhaps even a short overseas trip for research, and deletes it, the violation feels monumental. It is not just a lost opportunity, it is the calculated murder of a future self. The wife's realization dawns slowly. Artie doesn't want a partner. He wants an audience of one, completely captive. The film's emotional crescendo arrives when the wife finally finds a crack in Artie's armor, perhaps through uncovering a secret about his own past, a previous betrayal, a source of his deep-seated fear of abandonment that fuels his need for control. Armed with this knowledge, she confronts him, not with anger, but with a quiet, devastating logic that cuts through his carefully constructed facade of dominance. The scene where she refuses to participate in his game, perhaps by openly meeting the director for a final, defining conversation right under Artie's watchful eye, is electric. It's a declaration that her narrative, however messy or uncertain, is finally hers to write, even if the final chapter involves walking away from the security he violently provided. The true tension then shifts. Can she escape before his need to control morphs into something truly dangerous? The oppressive atmosphere fostered by the contract marriage begins to subtly erode the wife's very identity, turning her vibrant internal world into a landscape of cautious performance. Consider her attempts at maintaining normalcy. Perhaps she was an avid painter before the marriage, finding solace in the tactile process of blending oils. Now, her canvases are either rolled up and hidden away, or worse, she finds herself painting in muted, neutral tones that Artie would approve of, colors that reflect the decor he meticulously selected for their shared spaces. This self-censorship, born from fear of provoking his next controlling maneuver, is perhaps the most tragic casualty of their arrangement. Artie's professional demeanor, likely honed in the cutthroat world of venture capital, where reputation is everything, becomes his marital weapon. He doesn't shout, he analyzes weaknesses with the calm precision of an auditor. If he suspects his wife is growing too close to the director, he won't issue a direct ultimatum. Instead, he might use his considerable network to quietly downgrade the director's latest investment round, subtly reminding the outsider that engaging with his wife carries a professional cost. This calculated economic warfare is far more frightening than any emotional outburst because it demonstrates the depth of his reach and the methodical nature of his protectionism, or rather, his possessiveness. The moments of supposed tenderness are exquisitely painful. When Artie, fresh from closing a massive deal that has elevated his status further, attempts reconciliation, he does so with a grand gesture. A trip to a remote, luxurious locale where they are utterly isolated. In these isolated settings, his need for her attention is absolute, magnified by the silence of the surroundings. He might speak wistfully of wanting a pure partnership, unaware that his very definition of purity means the complete absence of external influence. The wife is caught in this confusing oscillation, the fear of his anger versus the seductive pull of being the absolute, singular focus of such intense energy, however warped. It mirrors the trap many feel in successful but suffocating careers. The rewards are high, but the cost to the soul is devastating. The breaking point often involves a discovery that shatters the illusion that this is merely a transactional relationship gone awry. Perhaps she discovers that Artie engineered their initial meeting, not through coincidence, but through an elaborate background check and strategic placement designed to ensure the perfect, compliant partner. This revelation reframes every shared moment, every compliment, as part of a long-term acquisition strategy. When the confrontation finally comes, it is less about vengeance and more about reclaiming cognitive space. The wife might use a piece of evidence, a hidden surveillance log perhaps, or an old photograph of Artie looking genuinely happy before his current guarded state, to confront the core vulnerability beneath his control. Her final act of defiance isn't necessarily physical escape. It's the intellectual decision to stop narrating her life according to his script. If she leaves, she does so not because she fears him less, but because she values her own uncertain future more than his predictable tyranny. The film lingers on the quiet aftermath, suggesting that even if she achieves external freedom, the habit of looking over her shoulder, the internalization of his critical gaze, will be the longest-lasting part of the contract she must tear up. The resolution of the contract, when it finally arrives, is rarely as clean as the paperwork that initiated it. The aftermath often suggests that escaping a possessive architect of one's life leaves one structurally compromised. Having lived under constant surveillance, the wife now faces the daunting task of relearning spontaneity. Her initial attempts at reconnecting with the outside world, perhaps accepting a coffee invitation from a friendly colleague, or simply taking a long, meandering walk without a destination, are fraught with anxiety. Each unmonitored moment feels illicit, a constant echo of Artie's disapproval ringing in her ears even when he is miles away, or perhaps permanently gone. This period of rebuilding mirrors the process of an artist rediscovering their authentic style after years of working under a restrictive patron. The vibrant colors she once favored might initially seem too loud, too demanding of attention, and she may revert to neutral palettes, a subconscious attempt to remain invisible and thus safe. The emotional challenge is overcoming the learned response that visibility equals vulnerability. Her success, however minor in the context of Artie's vast achievements, becomes defined by small, internal victories, finishing a difficult painting that deviates from the safe aesthetic, or speaking her mind in a meeting without first rehearsing the potential repercussions. Artie, if he remains a presence, perhaps through lingering legal ties or shared business interests, continues to exert a subtle gravitational pull. His attempts to re-enter her life are rarely direct appeals to emotion. Instead, they manifest as insidious offers of help, couched in the language of necessity. He might anonymously fund a struggling gallery showing her rediscovered work, or use his influence to quietly squash a rumor started by a competitor, only to present the favor later as proof that she cannot truly survive without his protection. This manipulation weaponizes gratitude, attempting to reestablish the debt she owes him for her success and safety. The final commentary of the narrative often rests on whether the wife manages to fully assimilate the lessons learned without becoming cynical. Does the intense experience of being so completely controlled render her incapable of trusting genuine affection, seeing every act of kindness as a precursor to ownership? Or does the trial by fire forge a new, more resilient understanding of self-worth? The lingering implication is that the trauma of hypercontrol breeds a necessary, though painful, self-reliance. The audience is left with the sense that while the contract marriage is over, the battle for true autonomy, the right to live without permission, is a lifelong commitment, far more demanding and rewarding than any legal agreement. The silence after Artie's departure, whether literal or a finalized emotional severance, is not peace. It is a vacuum that her soul rushes to fill with old anxieties. The wife, perhaps now embracing the career she fought for, let us imagine her as a documentary filmmaker, a profession built on observing and exposing truths, finds that her lens is still calibrated to detect surveillance. She might start filming everyday moments, not for the film's narrative, but as a personal archive, a method of proving to herself that the events transpired, that her reality was not entirely manufactured by Artie's controlling mind. This footage is raw, handheld, shaky, a stark contrast to the polished, controlled imagery Artie preferred in his world of high-gloss real estate portfolios. Her interactions become lessons in establishing new parameters. When a new collaborator expresses enthusiasm for her vision, she instinctively pulls back, waiting for the inevitable critique or demand for modification. The collaborator, likely someone focused on authentic storytelling, might interpret this hesitation as insecurity, unaware that she is fighting the phantom limb of Artie's judgment. She has to consciously unlearn the necessity of justifying her existence, her time, her very thoughts. This is where the true depth of his influence is felt, not in the grand, dramatic gestures, but in the constant, quiet editing of her own internal monologue. Artie, meanwhile, might attempt to reassert control through proxies, a favorite tactic of those who fear direct confrontation but cannot relinquish dominance. Perhaps a mutual acquaintance, someone she trusted deeply, suddenly begins relaying carefully curated messages, warnings disguised as concern, highlighting the precarious nature of success achieved without Artie's backing. These maneuvers are designed to keep her off balance, suggesting that the walls of her newly claimed territory are porous, and that true safety resides only in the orbit of his power. This psychological pressure forces her to evaluate every relationship through a lens of potential betrayal, a painful inheritance from the contract. The film's final resonance often lies in an act of profound vulnerability that Artie could never have orchestrated or controlled. Imagine her premiering her documentary, the very film she struggled to complete while under his watch. The subject matter might subtly mirror her own ordeal, a brave exploration of control and freedom. When the lights come up and the audience responds not with hushed admiration for the production value, but with raw emotional recognition of the theme, that is her true emancipation. It is a moment where her creativity, once treated as a trinket to be displayed only when polished, becomes a beacon shared openly. The lingering understanding is that while Artie sought to own her narrative, she ultimately succeeded in writing his downfall, not with anger, but with undeniable truth. The subsequent phase of her life, post-contract, is less about celebration and more about rigorous excavation of the self. The documentary filmmaker, now operating under her own banner, finds that the discipline Artie inadvertently instilled, the relentless pursuit of perfection in documentation, has become her tool for self-healing. She She approaches her own emotional landscape with the same objective scrutiny she once applied to volatile political situations for her films. She starts keeping a private journal, not just of feelings, but of observed behaviors, charting the recurring patterns of caution that still dictate her actions, effectively creating a roadmap out of the internalized prison. Her newfound professional success brings the external world back into focus. But now, every opportunity carries an undercurrent of suspicion. When a prestigious festival invites her to speak, she meticulously vets the invitation, cross-referencing the organizers, checking for any potential financial ties to Artie's shell corporations. This hypervigilance is exhausting, a testament to how deeply the foundation of trust was undermined. She realizes that freedom isn't simply the absence of a controlling husband. It is the mental exhaustion required to constantly verify that absence. Artie's residual influence manifests in the strange, almost mythical way his name still carries weight in certain circles. If she is trying to secure funding for a more ambitious project, a quiet conversation with a potential backer might reveal a sudden coolness, a hesitation that smells distinctly of Artie's quiet disapproval. He doesn't need to make threats. He merely needs to be known as the man who was wronged, the powerful entity whose private arrangements should not be disturbed. This forces her to champion her work twice as hard, not just to prove its merit, but to prove its independence from his shadow. The emotional turning point often occurs during a moment of unexpected, uncomplicated human connection. Perhaps she strikes up a genuine, easy friendship with another artist, someone whose success is clearly their own, built on visible effort rather than leveraged influence. In observing this relationship, she recognizes what Artie's possessiveness truly lacked: reciprocity. Artie demanded adherence. This new connection offers exchange. The sight of two people comfortably disagreeing, yet still sharing laughter, becomes a profound, almost revolutionary experience for her, demonstrating that vulnerability doesn't automatically equate to destruction. The film concludes not with a dramatic showdown, but with a conscious choice to engage fully with an uncertain future. She might take on a project entirely outside her comfort zone, perhaps collaborating with a team whose chaotic energy stands in direct opposition to Artie's rigid order. The final scene might show her on location, and perhaps in a bustling, uncontrolled environment, laughing genuinely as a piece of equipment malfunctions. She doesn't immediately know how to fix it, and for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty doesn't trigger panic. It's an acknowledgement that some of life's most meaningful moments happen in the cracks, in the unscripted spaces that no contract, no matter how possessive, can ever truly manage to contain. The dust settling from the contract's termination reveals a landscape that is both liberated and scarred, much like a city recovering from a controlled demolition. The filmmaker, now fully inhabiting her role as an independent storyteller, finds that her greatest challenge is not battling external antagonists, but managing the internal echo chamber Artie cultivated. She begins to understand that true recovery involves systematically dismantling the internalized censor he installed within her creative process. Her documentary work shifts slightly. The next project tackles the subtle architecture of coercion, exploring how systemic power structures can mimic intimate relationships, revealing that Artie was merely an extreme manifestation of a societal tendency to value ownership over partnership. This new focus attracts unwanted attention, not from Artie directly, but from those who benefited from the structures he upheld. A powerful industrialist, perhaps a former associate of Artie's in the property sector, views her expose as an ideological threat. This antagonist operates with the same polished veneer as Artie, but their methods are less personal obsession and more corporate reputation management. They don't try to possess her, they try to discredit her work by attacking its funding sources and questioning its objective truthfulness, suggesting her trauma is merely performance art designed for accolades. The filmmaker must now utilize the very skills Artie unintentionally honed in her: meticulous verification and the relentless pursuit of verifiable proof. She delves into public records, cross-referencing financial data with deposition transcripts, turning her personal survival story into an academic, undeniable piece of evidence against casual cruelty. This methodical approach is her armor. Where Artie used emotion and fear as weapons, she counters with objective reality, a language he respects but cannot ultimately control once it leaves his domain. There are moments, however, when the loneliness of true independence creeps in. The easy camaraderie she shares with her new collaborators is genuine, yet it lacks the high-stakes intensity that defined her years with Artie. She realizes that obsessive control, for all its toxicity, provided an undeniable sense of purpose, the constant, clear enemy against which to define oneself. To fight against the absence of an enemy requires a far greater, quieter strength. She has to learn to generate her own imperative, to find motivation not in defiance, but in pure creation. The narrative arc culminates not in Artie's ruin, but in her definitive self-realization, broadcast to the world through her finished work. In the film's final sequence, she may revisit a place from their marriage, perhaps the sterile, architecturally perfect home they shared. But she approaches it not with haunting nostalgia, but with anthropological detachment. She documents the space, notes the flaws in the construction that Artie tried to mask with luxury, and finally walks away, not looking back. The victory is not in punishing him, but in proving that a life built on contract can be successfully deconstructed, leaving behind a self that is entirely unowned, beautifully imperfect, and finally, authentically free to wander. The true aftermath of her liberation manifests in a surprising relationship with time. Before, time was a commodity controlled by Artie. Every minute accounted for, every planned activity, a step toward his desired outcome. Now, time stretches out, vast and unstructured, initially inducing a mild panic akin to being adrift at sea. The filmmaker finds herself clinging to schedules, not mandated ones, but self-imposed schedules so rigid they almost mimic her former captivity. She schedules mandatory relaxation, mandatory unstructured thought, meticulously logging these moments of supposed freedom in her journal, an absurd attempt to quantify the unquantifiable nature of autonomy. Her professional success, fueled by the earlier, deeply personal documentary, opens doors to international collaboration, forcing her onto film sets in locations far removed from the manicured suburbs Artie favored. These new environments are chaotic, vibrant, and importantly, uncontrolled by any single entity. On a remote set, in a bustling, unpredictable city, she confronts a scenario that would have paralyzed her previously. A crucial piece of equipment fails, jeopardizing a tight shooting schedule. Instead of freezing, waiting for an authority figure to issue a directive, she finds herself instinctively delegating, accepting input from the local technicians, embracing the necessary improvisation. It's messy, imperfect, and exhilarating, a direct contradiction to the ordered sterility of her past life. This newfound ability to navigate disorder attracts the attention of a respected veteran cinematographer, a man known for his intuitive, almost philosophical approach to framing reality. He doesn't seek to mentor her in the controlling sense. Rather, he simply allows her space, offering technical advice only when explicitly requested, valuing her vision above all else. This relationship serves as a crucial counter-narrative to Artie. Where Artie saw vulnerability as weakness to be exploited, the cinematographer sees it as the necessary prelude to authentic expression. He encourages her to leave the lens slightly unfocused sometimes, suggesting that the blur hints at a deeper truth than clinical sharpness. Artie, now relegated to rumor and occasional financial maneuvering, attempts one final deeply personal act of sabotage, though indirectly. News leaks of a potential retrospective on his early architectural achievements, a sanitized version of his life story that conveniently omits the oppressive environment he created. This isn't aimed at winning her back. It's aimed at rewriting history, attempting to solidify the narrative that his life, even in its tyranny, was one of grand, unquestionable creation. The implication is clear. If she succeeds on her own terms, it cheapens the masterpiece that their marriage was supposed to be. The filmmaker chooses not to engage in a public battle, recognizing that debating a man obsessed with image control is futile. Instead, she premieres her follow-up film, a nuanced, compassionate look at the psychological cost of high-functioning control dynamics, subtly informed by her own experience, but universal in its scope. In the Q&A after the screening, when asked about the source of her inspiration, she speaks not of revenge or pain, but of clarity. She describes finding beauty in the unpredictable rhythm of collaboration and the strength in acknowledging one's own capacity for error. Her final declaration is delivered quietly, yet powerfully. I stopped waiting for permission to exist. That, ultimately, is the only contract worth honoring. The implication is that her life is no longer a performance for an audience of one, but a continuous, evolving work created for its own sake. The ongoing narrative arc pivots now on the delicate balance between celebrating hard-won autonomy and the residual phantom pains of intense emotional control. The filmmaker, having successfully navigated the immediate fallout, begins to integrate the hard lessons learned into her creative practice, transforming tactical survival into authentic artistic integrity. She starts seeing the world through a dual lens: the objective reality required for her documentary work and the subjective, felt experience of being unburdened. This duality creates a fascinating tension in her new projects. They possess a polished technical finish, but are underscored by a raw, almost visceral emotional honesty that was absent before. Her work on coercion gains unexpected traction, resonating deeply with audiences who recognize the insidious nature of subtle power plays in their own lives, whether professional or familial. This success, however, brings her into direct, albeit indirect, conflict with the circles Artie still inhabits. He doesn't need to send threats. The professional cold shoulder she receives from established media outlets that rely on Artie's network serves as a constant, low-level reminder of his reach. These organizations, steeped in the transactional ethics of his world, implicitly suggest that true success requires aligning oneself with established, predictable power, which Artie embodies. The filmmaker responds not with a frontal assault, but with strategic decentralization. She embraces independent distribution models, bypassing the established gatekeepers entirely. This move aligns perfectly with the ethos of her current documentary subject, building a structure so resilient and independent that outside interference becomes irrelevant. She cultivates a fiercely loyal, small audience, valuing genuine connection over broad, easily manipulated viewership numbers. This choice reveals a profound shift. She no longer seeks validation from powerful men who define worth, but from shared human understanding. In her personal life, the relationship with the senior cinematographer deepens into a quiet, mature partnership built on mutual respect for creative space. He is the antithesis of Artie. His confidence is quiet, rooted in decades of mastery, never requiring performance from her. There are moments where she unconsciously braces for criticism, a sudden silence during a screening, a thoughtful pause before a suggestion, only to find the pause is genuine contemplation, not calculation. These instances are small epiphanies, moments where the conditioned fear response finally deflates, replaced by the steady breath of trust. The ultimate resolution is found in the act of letting go of the need for Artie's narrative to be explicitly corrected or punished. She understands that attempting to dismantle his carefully constructed public image would only tether her further to his orbit. Instead, she focuses on building her own legacy so undeniable, so intrinsically valuable, that his carefully curated retrospective becomes a historical footnote compared to her living, breathing body of work. The final image of the film might not be her walking away from a place, but rather her leading a diverse team into an unknown location for a new shoot. Her face illuminated by the rising sun, a light source entirely natural, unreflected, and entirely her own to capture. The contract is truly dissolved when she stops needing to prove she isn't his property and simply starts living as her own creator. The final stage of her reclaiming process involves a conscious effort to integrate the shadow self, the part molded by intense scrutiny, into a more holistic identity rather than simply banishing it. The filmmaker recognizes that the obsessive attention to detail, the relentless cross-checking of facts, which Artie weaponized into control, is also the bedrock of her cinematic credibility. She begins to harness this internal rigor, applying it not to fear, but to the pursuit of irrefutable, complex truths in her subjects. She starts developing a documentary series focused on the hidden economies of control in ostensibly free societies. A project so meticulous and well-sourced that it silences even the most cynical industry whispers. This mastery over objective truth provides a shield against the last vestiges of Artie's psychological imprint. When an old acquaintance, clearly acting as an intermediary, attempts to subtly undermine a grant application by questioning the filmmaker's stability post-divorce, she responds not with defensive explanations, but with meticulous documentation of her project's success metrics and budgetary transparency. The intermediary is left speechless, confronted by accountability rather than emotional plea. It is the ultimate victory, using the very language of power and documentation that Artie respected, but redirecting it toward transparency rather than oppression. The relationship with the cinematographer evolves beyond professional respect into a true partnership, one characterized by a deep, almost unspoken understanding of boundaries. He challenges her creatively by pushing her toward ambiguity, forcing her to trust her gut when the facts are inconclusive, the exact opposite of what Artie demanded. During a tense editing session where she is wrestling with a particularly harrowing interview sequence, she finds herself on the verge of cutting a crucial, painful admission because it feels too revealing, too dangerous. He simply looks at her and says, "That moment is the truth. Don't package it for safety." This gentle permission to be raw, to risk exposure without punishment, is the final therapeutic breakthrough. The narrative circles back, unexpectedly, to a public forum, perhaps a major industry award ceremony where her latest work is nominated. Artie, ever the connoisseur of spectacle, is reportedly in attendance. The filmmaker steps onto the stage, not with defiance, but with quiet grace. She does not mention him, not even in veiled terms. Her acceptance speech focuses solely on the necessity of creating art that honors complexity, that refuses to simplify human struggle into binaries of victim and villain, owner and owned. The final, lingering scene is not about confrontation or escape, but about continuation. She is shown months later, not accepting an award, but working quietly on location, perhaps directing a child actor in a scene requiring genuine, unrestrained emotion. She kneels down, meeting the child's gaze without judgment, offering not instruction, but simple encouragement. The lens is steady, the light is natural, and the moment is entirely unscripted, unowned. The contract with Artie is finally obsolete because she has signed a new, unbreakable one. A lifelong commitment to the integrity of her own vision. A vision that finally sees herself not as an asset to be possessed, but as the sole author of her own experience. The true measure of her freedom is ultimately reflected in her dreams, which for years had been dominated by oppressive architecture and the ceaseless, rhythmic tick of a security alarm. Now, the subconscious landscape shifts. Her nights are filled with sweeping, panoramic vistas, open fields, turbulent seas, landscapes that possess a scale Artie's meticulously controlled environments could never encompass. Sometimes a figure appears in the periphery of these dreamscapes, a tall, impeccably tailored shadow, and she feels a familiar clench in her chest. But instead of waking in a cold sweat, she addresses the shadow directly within the dream, perhaps even walking toward it, only to find that as she approaches, the sharp lines of the figure blur, the expensive fabric dissolves, and the shadow dissipates into light, revealing nothing substantial beneath. This symbolic deconstruction of his imposing presence signifies the final internal capitulation of his power. The filmmaker finds that her most powerful antidote to control is profound, selfless engagement with the immediate. She begins volunteering, not for resume padding, but for the sheer, unmediated reality of connecting with people whose struggles exist entirely outside the rarefied, transactional atmosphere of high finance and art patronage. Working with a grassroots organization dedicated to preserving local, unglamorous histories, the stories of forgotten neighborhoods, of small businesses that survived through sheer grit, she finds a grounding reality. Here, success isn't measured in market share or critical acclaim, but in tangible human impact. A story saved, a community preserved for another generation. This work requires empathy, a faculty Artie systematically tried to atrophy in her. The lingering scent of Artie's influence surfaces in the most unexpected places. She finds herself pausing before purchasing a piece of art, not because she fears the cost, but because she instinctively calculates the item's potential resale value, an automatic appraisal mechanism inherited from years of living within his asset-driven worldview. A mentor gently points this out. You're still optimizing, my dear. Optimization is fine for finance. For living, you need friction, inefficiency, and beauty that simply is without market justification. This observation sparks a profound realization. She needs to actively court inefficiency to allow for mistakes that serve no quantifiable purpose other than growth. The final, deliberate severance from Artie's lingering shadow comes not through a public denouncement, but through an act of profound, almost defiant ordinariness. Perhaps she chooses to sell the luxury apartment they once shared, a fortress of glass and steel that represented peak compliance. She refuses to engage in the high stakes negotiation, opting instead for a fair, quick sale to a young, earnest family looking to put down roots. She doesn't maximize the profit, she minimizes the transaction time. As she hands over the keys, she notices the clean, unforgiving lines of the minimalist architecture and feels only a detached pity for the man who mistook immaculate structure for actual foundation. In the film's epilogue, years later, she is shown walking through a vibrant, slightly unruly community garden, a project born from her volunteer work. Her hands are stained with earth, her clothing practical and worn. She is mid-conversation, animatedly gesturing about a narrative problem in her script, her face alight with collaborative energy. There is no cinematographer beside her, no shadow figure lurking in the background. There is only the sun, the dirt, and the tangible, messy evidence of a life deliberately chosen, moment by unmonitored moment, a life where the only contract that matters is the continuous, evolving agreement she holds with herself. The narrative engine driving Suami Kontrak yang Posesif nonton online, or the possessive contract husband available online, immediately signals a familiar landscape within contemporary Southeast Asian romantic melodramas, often leveraging the potent dynamic of a transactional or arranged marriage, quickly complicated by genuine, albeit highly pressurized, emotion. The premise itself, a contract marriage, serves as a dramatic crucible, forcing two individuals, usually from disparate social or emotional spheres, into enforced intimacy. This structural choice is less about novelty and more about efficiency. It fast-tracks the conflict inherent in forced proximity while providing a clear, albeit artificial boundary that the characters must inevitably cross. Analyzing the core performances requires looking beyond the immediate chemistry to the established archetypes these actors frequently embody. If the male lead adheres to the genre's typical blueprint, he is likely channeling the disciplined, often emotionally stunted, corporate titan. Actors stepping into this role, perhaps drawing inspiration from the stoic, brooding leading men prominent in early 2010s Korean dramas that heavily influenced regional serialization formats, must balance impenetrable facade with the nascent vulnerability required by the plot. Their past, perhaps marked by a controlling familial environment or a singular professional focus that stunted emotional growth, justifies the possessive aspect of the contract. It is often not true malice, but an overcorrection, a desire for control in one area of life that spills disastrously into the realm of personal commitment. Conversely, the female protagonist usually represents a grounded reality, contrasting sharply with the male lead's gilded cage. Her motivations for entering the contract, often financial necessity or the need to protect a family member, establish her initial moral high ground. The actress playing this role carries the weight of making the audience believe in her reluctant participation. Her character's internal journey is the audience's entry point. We watch her slowly dismantle the walls erected by the contract terms and the hero's controlling tendencies. This mirrors the career trajectory of many actresses in this market segment, who successfully transition from ingenue roles to more complex portrayals of resilience, often citing influences from domestic screenwriting traditions that emphasize female agency within oppressive structures. The possessiveness detailed in the title is the film's central tension point. It's a carefully calibrated element. Too much, and the narrative collapses into abuse. Too little, and the stakes dissipate. The screenwriter navigates this by framing the possessiveness not as violent control, but as extreme protectiveness born from sudden, unexpected attachment. This often manifests through subtle, yet significant intrusions into her life. Managing her schedule, vetting her acquaintances, or imposing rules designed to keep her isolated within the gilded confines of their arrangement. This mirrors narrative trends where perceived external threats, business rivals, jealous ex-lovers, are used to justify the hero's overreach, providing a temporary justification for his behavior that allows the audience to root for the eventual softening of his stance. From a production standpoint, the visual language employed likely emphasizes this dichotomy. The contract husband resides in spaces characterized by stark modernity, sharp lines, and muted palettes, a visual representation of his emotional rigidity. The female lid, even when inhabiting his world, often retains visual anchors to her former life through softer fabrics or more vibrant personal effects, serving as constant, unspoken reminders of the authenticity he lacks. This visual storytelling is crucial in high-volume content production where character depth must sometimes be conveyed instantaneously through set design and costuming choices, a technique perfected by international streaming series aiming for rapid global consumption. Ultimately, the film functions as a modern fairy tale wrapped in the guise of contemporary realism. It sells the fantasy that genuine love can triumph over transactional beginnings, provided the hero is willing to surrender his absolute control, and the heroine is strong enough to demand that surrender. The enduring appeal lies in the cathartic moment when the contract is rendered obsolete, not by its expiry date, but by the undeniable, messy reality of human affection, finally breaking through the carefully constructed artifice of the agreement. The success of this particular narrative structure hinges critically on the perceived authenticity of the character's internal shifts, particularly that of the contract husband. We must understand why this powerful man, whose professional life is built on meticulous planning and predictable outcomes, finds his carefully ordered world disrupted by the unpredictable variable of his temporary spouse. Often, the backstory suggests a profound loneliness, perhaps stemming from a childhood where material success was valued above emotional connection. An actor channeling this requires a nuanced approach, utilizing minimal dialogue to convey immense internal turbulence. Think of subtle shifts in posture, the initial rigid spine relaxing slightly when she inadvertently smiles, or the fractional hesitation before he issues a controlling decree, a flicker of self-doubt crossing his otherwise placid features. This slow erosion of his defensive barriers is the audience's reward. He isn't just becoming protective, he is learning to feel dependent on her presence, a feeling entirely alien to his established identity. The heroine's resistance, conversely, must never feel like mere petulance. It must be rooted in self-respect. She is not simply an object being fought over, she is an agent navigating a hostile environment. Her initial compliance is a strategic maneuver, a necessary evil. Her emotional core, often depicted through quiet moments of vulnerability when she believes herself unseen, perhaps looking out a large, impersonal window at the city lights, highlights the cost of her sacrifice. This character often echoes the resilience seen in protagonists of classic regional literature who maintained their dignity while facing overwhelming socioeconomic pressure. Her development is marked by specific acts of defiance, perhaps subtly undermining one of his arbitrary rules by showing kindness to someone he has forbidden her from seeing, or by offering a piece of insightful, practical advice regarding his business that forces him to momentarily view her as an equal rather than a possession. The contract itself becomes a character in its own right, a legalistic manifestation of the hero's fear of vulnerability. The clauses regarding shared space, mandated public appearances, and limitations on outside communication are the physical manifestations of his possessiveness. When the narrative nears its climax, the tearing up or rewriting of this document is always the symbolic pivot point. It signifies the replacement of a man-made structure, the contract, with a natural one, love. The tension surrounding the contract's impending expiration date provides the narrative with its ticking clock, forcing the hero to accelerate his emotional reckoning. He has to realize that the cost of keeping her under the terms of the contract, even if it means perpetual superficiality, is far greater than the risk of admitting his true feelings and facing the potential rejection that comes with genuine emotional investment. Furthermore, the supporting cast plays a crucial role in validating the evolving relationship. We often see a skeptical best friend or a sharp-tongued older relative who initially mistrusts the hero's motives, serving as the voice of the audience's skepticism. Their eventual begrudging acceptance of the hero's transformation provides external validation that his internal change is real and socially acceptable. Without this mirroring effect, the hero's sudden emotional shift might feel unearned or purely situational. The dynamics here feed back into the broader cultural commentary present in such films. The idea that even the most powerful men must eventually answer to the collective social judgment embodied by the heroine's trusted circle. The romance is thus validated not just internally, but relationally. The inherent tension of the possessive contract husband trope often relies heavily on the staging of private moments versus public performance. In the corporate world, the hero must maintain an image of unimpeachable control, a facade that is painstakingly constructed and rarely breached. This public persona is often characterized by impeccably tailored suits and an almost military bearing, suggesting a man who views human interaction as a series of calculated negotiations. His inspiration might subtly echo figures from intense business dramas, where ruthless efficiency is prized above all else. He is the architect of his own success, demanding absolute adherence to his specifications, whether in the boardroom or within the confines of his contractually obligated home. However, the true depth of his character is revealed in the micro-interactions within their shared residence, spaces that are supposed to be neutral ground, but quickly become battlegrounds of conflicting wills. When he displays possessiveness, it's rarely through shouting, it's through chillingly calm directives. For instance, if the heroine receives an unexpected call from an old friend, his reaction might be a prolonged silence, followed by a measured inquiry into the friend's current social standing or professional relevance. A subtle way of asserting that any relationship she maintains must pass his implicit vetting process. This type of subtle surveillance is designed to make her feel constantly observed, reflecting the actor's commitment to portraying control as an internalized system, rather than just external aggression. The heroine's response to this constant oversight must articulate the film's central philosophical question. At what point does protective care become suffocating ownership? Her emotional landscape must evolve from fear mixed with resentment to a guarded form of empathy. A key scene, frequently employed in these narratives, involves the heroine realizing a profound, perhaps unacknowledged, depth of loneliness in the hero. This realization often occurs when she finds him alone late at night, perhaps staring at old photographs or engaging in a solitary, non-work related activity that reveals a softer, less guarded self. This glimpse into his core vulnerability, the very thing he is trying to protect her from experiencing himself, is what allows her to momentarily suspend her judgment. The actress often conveys this shift through a profound stillness, a moment where her own needs for autonomy temporarily yield to the surprising revelation of his damaged interior. The concept of online viewing, referenced in the title, subtly introduces a meta layer of commentary on modern relationships and public scrutiny. Even within their private contract, the characters are aware, perhaps subconsciously, that their arrangement is a performance, something that could be exposed or discussed. This awareness fuels their need for secrecy and heightens the stakes of their deception. When they are forced into public settings, galas, corporate events, their chemistry must be flawlessly manufactured. The heroine, whose initial wardrobe might have been practical and understated, must now convincingly mimic the elegance required of the contract wife. This transformation is often assisted by the hero, yet every borrowed gown and every perfectly executed public smile serves as a reminder that their connection is still tethered to a legal fiction, not genuine desire. The film then resolves when the public performance aligns seamlessly with an authentic internal bond, rendering the contract and the need for staged appearances obsolete because their affection can withstand genuine public scrutiny. The resolution of the contract necessitates a confrontation not just with the legal document, but with the foundational lies upon which their relationship was built. Once the emotional truth surfaces, the narrative demands a period of necessary separation, often referred to as the dark night of the soul, for both characters. The hero, having finally dismantled his walls, experiences the stark emptiness of freedom without her. The control he sought to impose was merely a desperate attempt to fill his own void. His professional life, previously his source of validation, becomes hollowed out. This phase allows the audience to confirm that his change is permanent, as he actively chooses to pursue her without the leverage of the contract. He must now operate on equal footing, stripped of his corporate authority when dealing with her. The heroine, during this separation, undergoes her own critical transformation. She must transition from being the object of his possessiveness, whether unwanted or reluctantly accepted, to becoming a self-defined entity who actively chooses to return to him, or perhaps chooses a different path entirely, leaving the ultimate romantic outcome deliberately ambiguous until the very last act. Her reclaiming of autonomy is often symbolized by returning to an environment that reflects her original self, perhaps taking on a passion project she abandoned due to the contract's demands. This resurgence of personal ambition confirms that she is not merely a romantic prize, but a fully realized individual whose affection must be earned anew, not inherited, through a legal agreement. The final reconciliation, therefore, is never a simple return to the status quo. It must involve a public, or at least deeply significant, acknowledgement of the damage caused by his initial controlling behavior. If the film aspires to a more mature emotional resolution, the hero must offer a tangible act of self-abasement or profound apology that demonstrates a complete understanding of the imbalance of power. This might involve him publicly supporting her career goals against his own initial reservations, or making a sacrifice that directly contradicts his previous dictates of control, perhaps willingly ceding control over a shared asset or publicizing a vulnerability he once fiercely guarded. The narrative arc concludes when the possessiveness transforms entirely into true partnership, where mutual respect replaces unilateral command, solidifying the audience's belief that the temporary arrangement ironically forged a lasting, authentic connection built on the ruins of artifice. The weight of this final reconciliation rests heavily on the visual rhetoric employed by the director to signify lasting change. The sterile, hypermodern aesthetics that define the hero's world at the film's outset must visibly soften. If the initial shared apartment was all glass and sharp angles, the environment of the final act should incorporate warmer textures, perhaps revisiting locations from the heroine's past that now feel welcoming rather than threatening, suggesting the hero has learned to appreciate the nuances of her world. This visual realignment mirrors the internal acceptance that true intimacy requires shared space, not just adjacent proximity governed by rules. Furthermore, the dialogue surrounding commitment in the closing scenes must pivot from legalistic language, terms, conditions, expiration, to language rooted in aspiration and shared future. The hero, who once dictated schedules, now asks open-ended questions about dreams and long-term goals, signaling a genuine curiosity about her interior life beyond her utility to him. The actor portraying him must convey a sense of hopeful anxiety. The fear of losing her has now been replaced by the fear of disappointing her, a much more human and earned vulnerability. His past possessiveness, when referenced, should be met not with outright condemnation, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the pain it caused, allowing for a path toward true forgiveness rather than mere tolerance. The audience's investment in this ending is predicated on the belief that the heroine has not compromised her core identity to secure the relationship. Her final acceptance must be a confident stride forward, not a retreat back into dependence. If she chooses to stay, it is because the man standing before her has become someone worthy of that choice, someone who has actively dismantled the structures of control he once imposed. Her smile in the final frame should possess a depth that wasn't present in the earlier, forced smiles of public performance, a look that signifies safety canal found not in a contract, but in chosen, unconditional, mutual regard. This final tableau solidifies the film's underlying message. The most valuable contracts are the ones we choose to tear up once authentic love provides a superior framework for connection. The enduring satisfaction derived from the contract marriage narrative, particularly one infused with possessive elements, lies in the ritualistic destruction of legal boundaries, replaced by emotional ones. The very specificity of the initial contractual terms, the detailed clauses regarding public presentation, the separation of bedrooms, the mandated duration, serves as an excellent dramatic foil. Each requirement that the hero enforces is a tangible representation of his emotional deficit. When these rules begin to crumble, often initiated by the heroine's quiet acts of subversion, the audience witnesses a form of character rehabilitation that feels hard-won. Consider the nuanced depiction of the hero's professional life post-realization. If he is an architect or CEO, the narrative often shows his newfound emotional clarity bleeding into his work. Decisions that were once purely profit-driven might now incorporate an element of ethical consideration or employee well-being, subtly suggesting that his capacity for empathy has expanded beyond the confines of the contractual relationship. This external validation is important. It assures the viewer that the transformation isn't a temporary romantic delusion, but a fundamental restructuring of his worldview, echoing the career arcs of real-life tycoons who sometimes find philanthropy or human-centric business models only after experiencing personal upheaval. For the heroine, her ultimate power move is often relational, rather than material. Having navigated his possessiveness, she understands the levers of his emotional control better than anyone. Her decision to finally reveal a secret or challenge him on a deep-seated insecurity, something entirely unrelated to the contract's stipulations, is the true moment of parody. She demonstrates that she sees the man beneath the powerful mask, and her acceptance is contingent on his acceptance of his own fragility. This requires the actress to maintain an almost shamanistic presence throughout the film, the quiet observer who eventually becomes the guiding force. The resolution often avoids a grand public declaration of love, which might feel too theatrical given the inherent artifice of the setup. Instead, the climax often occurs in a quiet, private space, perhaps the place where the initial contract was signed or the location of their first genuinely shared moment. It is here, away from the necessary performance required by the external world, that the final terms are agreed upon, not between lawyers, but between two people acknowledging their mutual, flawed need for each other. The final, lingering shot often focuses not on a kiss, but on a shared, mundane, domestic action, making coffee together, or simply sitting in comfortable silence, signaling that the grand drama of the contract has resolved into the enduring, quiet drama of partnership. The lingering resonance of a successful possessive contract marriage narrative often resides in the aftermath, the critical space between the dramatic climax of forced commitment and the mundane reality of sustained partnership. Once the contract is officially voided or superseded by genuine feeling, the characters face the less cinematic, but ultimately more challenging task of integration. The residual habits born from the contract's restrictive framework do not vanish overnight. They become the subtle friction points of the newly authentic relationship. The hero, accustomed to dictating environments, might still exhibit reflexive, controlling behavior, such as automatically assuming logistical planning for their shared future without consultation. The narrative must allow for these relapses, framing them not as betrayals, but as echoes of past conditioning. The heroine's growth is demonstrated by her ability to recognize these patterns immediately and address them calmly without resorting to the dramatic confrontation that characterized their early interactions. She no longer needs to fight for her space. She merely needs to assert her boundary with practiced ease. This shift from performative defiance to established self-advocacy is crucial for the audience to accept the longevity of their bond. It shows that the power dynamic has fundamentally inverted. His respect is now earned daily through conscious choice, not enforced by legal mandate. Furthermore, the film benefits from showing how their union impacts the professional spheres that initially forced them together. If the heroine entered the contract for financial rescue, her continued presence in the hero's orbit must now be on her own terms, perhaps managing a division of the company she helped save or launching an independent venture with his support, carefully differentiated from his direct control. This ensures that her identity remains intact, preventing the narrative from retrogressing into the scenario where her worth is solely tied to her association with him. The actor playing the hero must portray genuine pride in her independent success, a complex emotion that requires suppressing any vestige of the old possessiveness that might view her rising stature as a threat to their equilibrium. The inspiration for this final phase often draws from romantic ideals where true partnership means amplification, not absorption. The film subtly communicates that the contract, for all its flaws, served as a high-pressure laboratory that revealed their deepest needs. The lingering memory of the possessive desire transforms into a fierce, protective loyalty, the desire to shelter her from external harm, not from the world of the hero himself. The closing sequence, therefore, should feel like a quiet affirmation. Two people who survived an engineered intimacy and chose, freely and without constraint, to build a shared future upon the understanding that true love requires the continuous, conscious surrender of control. The lingering question that often shadows the happily ever after in these genre pieces is the sustainability of the hero's transformation, especially concerning the inherent nature of his possessiveness. While the contract may be void, the deeply ingrained psychological framework of control, built over years of professional dominance and personal isolation, requires constant vigilance. This theme suggests that the film's true sequel lies in the small, unfilmed moments of their married life, where the hero must actively choose vulnerability over certainty. We see this tension manifested in how they approach shared decision-making, particularly concerning future family planning or long-term investments, areas where the hero's inclination toward unilateral executive action might resurface under stress. If the heroine is shown becoming a mother